Okay, so now it's time to implement some actual functionality in our app. We have our layouts all down, now it's time to give the code some meat. So we're going to first add in some global variables, and these are going to be variables we'll use throughout many of our functions. So there won't be many functions in this app, but there will be a few, and we'll be using these variables a couple of times, so it's a good idea to declare them as global. And we're also going to add in some of the functions that will perform the calculation and display aspects of our code. Okay, so now we're all set up to actually begin implementing the functionality of our code. So we have our 5 outlets all ready for us to use here, and our 2 action functions. And on our layout we have the title label, input, calculate button, display label, and the reset button. So we're all ready to go. We can actually implement the main functionality of this code, which is actually going to be quite simple. So we'll start off by creating some global variables, and then we'll start creating some functions that we'll use throughout the text, and we'll just need a few of these. Before we do, however, let's just go ahead and run this to see what happens when we press the buttons and try and enter text. So I'm just going to hit the run button, and I'm running with the iPhone SE. The reason I choose that is because this is the device I designed my layout on. You guys are more than welcome to choose a different device. I just recommend that you run the simulator or run the emulator with the same device that you designed your layout on. Otherwise you might get sizing issues. So we're just going to go ahead and open up the simulator here, and this is what it looks like right now. Again, this is not going to be our final design because this is a little boring. So let's just go ahead and try and enter some text, and you see you can't see, but I'm pressing the keyboard now and nothing's happening. That's because we have the phone keyboard enabled and the main computer keyboard disabled. If we want to change that, we can go up to hardware. As long as we have the simulator selected, we can go to hardware, we can go to keyboard, and we're going to check connect hardware keyboard. So I'm going to select this just by clicking it, and then that enables me to use the keyboard rather than the on phone keyboard. I prefer using the keyboard just because I think it's a lot faster than clicking each of the individual buttons. But it's totally up to you. It's all personal preference. So right now if we try and enter something and press calculate or reset, nothing happens. And nothing happens to the text we enter, and that's fine. That's what we'd expect because in our viewcontroller.swift we haven't actually implemented anything for these for the button presses. We just have these blank functions. So right now it's saying when the button is pressed, do nothing. And that's exactly what it's doing. It's not doing anything. So we'll just minimize this and stop running the simulator. And now let's actually implement something within these buttons. So the first thing is going to be creating these global variables. And I'm going to put these just above the view.did_load and underneath the outlets. The reason I'm declaring these variables as global is because we'll be using these throughout a few different functions, and so if you're ever unsure of if you'll need to use these variables again or not, declare them as global, because to have these global variables allows you to use them throughout the code. Now for those of you who are unsure of what I mean by global, I mean if we create this variable, for example I, and just say equal to 5, we won't use this, but I'm just giving this as an example. If we create this variable, I can use this throughout any of these functions. Any of these 4 functions I can use my variable I in. If I, however, initialized it or created it, oh, that's weird. So we want to command copy, or rather command cut and paste. I can only use variable I within the scope of the view.did_load function. Okay, so that means if I try to call I in here, I get nothing showing up. Whereas if I put it as a global variable and then called I get I as one of my options here. Okay, so again, declaring these variables as global allows you to use them in many different functions. However, if you know you're only going to use it in one function, just declare it as a local variable, keep it within that function. Okay, so what do we want to have as variables up here? Well, let's think, what do we need to calculate an average? Well, first of all, we need an average. So I'm just going to create this average, and it should be of type double. And I'm just going to initialize it to be 0 right now. In fact, yes, I'm going to initialize it to be 0. And so I gave it a type, double, you don't have to give it a type if you want. You could omit this code altogether and just have variable average equals 0. I just think it's good practice to get into the habit of declaring these types of variables. Okay, so yeah, again, what do we need for an average? Well, we calculate an average by dividing the total, or the sum of all of your elements, dividing by the number of elements in the list. So let's say we have 5 elements. We want to add them all up and divide by 5, and that will give us the average. So we'll need 2 numbers there. We'll need a total, and that's going to be a double also. And we'll need a count, which is going to be an integer. And we'll leave this as 0. In fact, let's just declare it as a double so that we get no issues when we're trying to perform functions. Sometimes Swift doesn't like us trying to divide a double by an integer, and so that kind of leads to issues. If we leave our count as a double, however, that's fine. It will take up a little bit more room in memory, but because these apps and these computers are so powerful, you really will notice absolutely no difference. Keeping in mind that if this was a massive program and there were all doubles instead of ints, you might see a little bit of slowdown. But in our app, it really doesn't make a difference. So now we have an average, a total, and a count. We'll get our average value by dividing total by count, and we get the total by taking in user inputs. Okay, so the next thing will be to actually do something to handle the user input. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to, inside our press calculate function, we're going to take in that as an input. So we're going to create this new variable, and this will be input number. In fact, I'm just going to say input, and I'm going to set it equal to the double version of whatever our edit text input or our text field input is. So txt input text outlet dot text, and I'm going to add in the exclamation mark to show that it must have a value in order to assign input to be a variable of this type. So again, the reason I'm adding this in, and you'll have to do this a lot actually, is that this just means that in order to declare and give this variable input a value, in order to declare and initialize it, we have to have some kind of a value for our text input text outlet. Okay, so this can't be blank text. It can't contain the value of nil. Okay, so now we have this input, which is going to be the input text outlet dot text converted to a double. That's all very good. What are we going to do with it? Well, we need to perform some kind of calculation on it, and for that we're going to need some calculation function. I try to keep as little functionality within these press buttons or within these action functions as possible, just because I think it's not a good idea to kind of cluster them up. I would rather create functions at the bottom and call them within these action functions. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to create this function called, it's going to be called calculate average, and it's going to take in this variable that's going to be the input, and it's going to be of type double. So this is going to be input number, and this is going to be of type double. It's not going to return anything, however, because we're going to call a print function on it. And in fact, let's just do that now. Let's just create this function that's just going to be a display average, and that's not going to take in anything. It's not going to return anything. And we know we'll have to have a function to handle this press reset button, so I'm just going to create one now, and this is just going to be called reset values. Okay, so now we have 3 functions set up and ready for us to use. Ready for us to implement, I should say. So we have our calculate average function, and this will actually perform the average calculation. We'll have this display average function, which will display the average that we have calculated, and we have this reset values function, which will just reset everything back to 0. So let's take a look at our first calculate average function. Well, we know that it's going to take in this input, and in fact let's call it now. So we'll call calculate average. It's going to be the first choice there, and we're going to give it input as the parameter. So now we're taking in this variable, we're creating this variable input. Just going to put that there. And it's going to be equal to the double conversion of our text field text. And now we're feeding in that input number into the calculate average function. Now, again, to calculate an average, we have to take our total, and then we have to divide it by the number of elements. So how do we calculate an average? Well, an average will be equal to the total divided by count. Okay, so we know this is going to be needed at some point. However, we haven't really given values for total and count yet. So let's do this. We'll say total plus equals input number. Now what I'm doing here with this line is I'm saying total is equal to whatever the current value of total is plus the input number. So it's the same as calling this equals total plus input number. So this is basically saying whatever the current value of total is plus the input number, which is going to be the same number as the user enters here, is going to be equal to the total. Okay, that's all this line up here is doing. And so now we have a total that's building up. What about count? Well, how do we increase count? We want to increase count every time an element is added to our average. So we should probably increase count in our press calculate button function. So what we're going to do is we're going to say count plus equals 1. And again, same thing as saying count equals count plus 1. Okay, so this just increases count by 1 every time the button is pressed, which means that every time an input, every time a new number is added and the calculate function is pressed, that means we're adding another element to our average, so we need to increase count by 1. Okay, so now we have our function all set up and it should be working just fine. We have our total is equal to whatever the current value of total is plus the input number, and our average is equal to our new total divided by count, which is increasing every time an element is added. Okay, so if you're still a little unsure about whether or not this math is correct, go ahead and try it on a piece of paper, add in some values, but I assure you this is correct, and we will see this working in just a little bit here. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to implement our display average function. Now all this is going to do is it's going to assign the label text to display our current average. So we're going to say LBL display average outlet dot text is equal to the average, but we need to convert this to a string because it's a double right now. So we'll take the string version of our average. Okay, so basically just assigning this label text to display the current average. Now where do we call this function? Well, when our calculate average button or our calculate button is pressed, it's going to take in this input and calculate the average. So I think it would be a good idea to display the average at the same time. We can't put it before the calculate average, otherwise it will display the old average. So what we'll do is we'll put the function call after our calculate average function call. So now what we're doing is once a calculate button is pressed, we're going to take in our input, convert it to a double. We're going to increase count by 1. Then we're going to call the calculate average function on our input number. Our calculate average function is then going to add our input number to the total, and it's going to calculate our average by dividing our new total by the new count. So then our global variable average now contains the current value of the current average, and we're then going to call the display average function. And the display average function is just going to change the display average outlet text to contain the string version of our average. Okay, so that's all that's going on so far, and in fact that's where I'm going to end. I'm going to pause this for a bit and just kind of let you guys take this all in. If you're still unsure of how things are going, just kind of follow the control flow. So follow from here down to where the function ends. Okay, so if, for example, calling this calculate average function, it will perform these tasks and then that's all it does, then it ends the function, and then we can move on to the next one, display average. Okay, so just take a second, soak that all in, and in the next part we'll implement the reset values and some other fun stuff. Okay, so now we implemented some actual functionality in our app. So we added in some variables, some global variables, and these were total, count, and average. These are all doubles, and our total obviously is going to be the grand total of all the numbers added. Our count is going to be the number of numbers that we've added, and we also have an average, which is going to be the average that we'll display. We added in a couple of functions that were just the calculation and display functions, and we called them from the press calculate button function, so that when this function is called, so when the button presses, or rather when the button is pressed, then it will call this calculation function and then it will display the average in this display function.